mythology and religion over time. So the stories that we tell about our own cultures from our myths and our religions change and view their own histories as time passes. Everywhere from Tang China to late antique Rome, from Athens to Alexandria, our panelists' research puts us in the shoes of those who are learning and discussing their own pasts through mythological and religious lens. Now, in just a moment, we will have our first presenter, Justin Winslett. Justin is a scholar with an extensive experience in higher education in the UK, having held posts at the universities of Cambridge, Oxford, Manchester, and Sheffield. His research focuses primarily on the supernatural and extra-human in texts and material culture in China's early empires, roughly the first millennium CE, and has been published in a number of scholarly works on the subject, most recently having contributed to a co-authored book, The Spiritual Geography of Early China. A devoted teacher, Justin has taught numerous classes related to to classical Chinese and pre-modern East Asia at university, but has engaged extensively in outreach activities, working in local schools and even traveling to overseas programs in Thailand, Indonesia, and China to provide education on pre-modern Asia. His paper is titled The History of the Strange, The Emergence of an Historical Consciousness in Tang Tales. Justin, if you would, please go ahead and share your screen and you may begin. Thank you so much.
Thank you. There we are. All right, that should be shown. Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. So yes, basically this talk, as stated, the title of the talk, The History of the Strange, The Emergence of an Historical Consciousness in Tang Tales, basically is going to talk a bit about how basically what we can understand as an historical consciousness and what we saw, and I'll discuss a little bit about what we mean, kind of develops in the Tang and what we kind of see with regards to that. Now, those in the audience who are familiar a little bit with sort of China and Chinese history might already be very familiar with the idea of Chinese historiography. Indeed, the thing is, Chinese historiography is somewhat monolithic, let's put it that way, within the framework of particularly modern China and contemporary China. Modern China and contemporary China. And this is partly due to events that occurred in the 20th century. History as a concept became strongly associated with nation building, identity, modernization, also this and other things in China. It's also partly to do with the rise of social sciences in Western academia that also looked at China as a particular other and were exploring it in ways. Again, this isn't a talk on that. I'm not going to talk about the 20th century because that's the modern period. But basically, again, just to kind of frame it for those of you who may not be familiar, the idea of Chinese historiography is actually very well studied and trodden. Basically, within this sort of scholarship, there are three very dominant understandings of how we, as modern people, when we're reading these texts, are kind of expected to understand the history that we see in Chinese texts. The first is that basically history is rooted on the traditions and conventions of a text called the Shiji, which is considered the very first sort of standard imperial history of China, and in fact, basically is the conventions and the tropes that it adopts and uses are then further adopted later on. Now, they are adopted, and what will be important for us is that they are adopted much more widely than simply within the confines of, say, what becomes known as imperial history. And indeed, imperial history, as we understand it, isn't really written until much later from the Shiji. The Shiji itself is dated to the 2nd century BC, but actually the kind of notion that it forms this kind of lineal history doesn't really arise until really around the 14th century CE. Now, basically, the second kind of point about how we are supposed to understand Chinese historiography is that history is very much the realm and the purpose of what's called literati culture, particularly that of the late imperial period, which is basically for China in the second millennium CE. Now, in this period, people in China basically were to advance themselves to be employed by the imperial offices. They had to pass what was known as the civil service exam. This exam very much just sort of shaped Chinese history, or, well, yes, actually, pretty much everything to do with China at this time. And so history became a part of that sort of education and that curriculum to learn to pass the civil service exam. The purposes of history and the use of it basically was involved mainly for the literati and for the literati to understand why they're there and what it means to be a literatus, as it were. Further, history was meant to be read as providing a didactic. Literati from this time would quote or cite or paraphrase or reference historical events or historical personages, and readers were expected to understand that there was some sort of moral lesson to be learnt from reading those. Okay. Now, as I said, this is very much the kind of dominant and very, very sort of staid way in which pre-modern Chinese history has generally been portrayed as being understood. However, many scholars, going back as people like Peter Bol or Hilda de Weert, and myself included, will point out that there is one very salient problem with using these principles and imposing them all over across all of what we call pre-modern China, i.e. before the 20th century. And that is, all of these concerns are very much associated with the late imperial period. Prior to the 10th century, the Chinese empires did not really make use of the civil service exam. There were examples of it, but they didn't really use it to staff their governance. As such, they did not have a uniform education system which trained and taught students basically the things that they needed to know to pass a civil service exam. Further, the literati were more associated with the aristocracy and aristocratic culture than they were with their own kind of individual group or sort of associations of people. Also, without publishing, which is also something that comes in after the 10th century, basically texts were not distributed widely or as widely across the empire. In fact, quite simply, they were very sort of which texts people had access to was somewhat random. And again, particularly today, although there is some scholarship in trying to understand how these texts work and how they are all associated with it, or how people got associated with them, there's still a lot of questions as to, well, who had access to libraries, in what capacity were those libraries established, what was in those libraries, etc. Basically, without any kind of uniform constant culture and curriculum that culture expects there's the sort of the people who do know, the literate people, to engage in, there's no reason to presume that these kinds of what we call Chinese historiography really applied to anything before the 10th century. And as I will talk a little bit about, basically that raises a number of questions as to, well, how did these people understand history? As already mentioned, of course, each generation contributes and uses history and uses these stories and uses tales and uses things in their own way. And that brings us to basically the Taiping Guangzi, which basically is what I'm going to be talking a little bit about as basically one of the ways of kind of contributing to this question. Of course, as I just said, if before the 10th century you don't have any kind of uniform curricula, you don't have any sort of uniform education system, then basically what is it that how did these people understand the sort of history or the events that came before them, and what did they mean to them? Obviously, there's many, many, many different types of texts to look at, but in my research, I tend to work very much with this particular text known as the Taiping Guangji, which is basically a large compendia of tales that was organized in the 10th century of material that came before it. It's 500 volumes, 7,021 tales. You can see that. Those of you who are perhaps interested in the organization of knowledge and the creation of compendia, just as a slight aside, these sorts of massive works where the knowledge of the empire is being gathered and put together become a hallmark of the late imperial period, even though this is all material from the earlier imperial periods like the Tang. And so basically there's quite a bit of research on that, though that's not related to this talk exactly. What's more important is that all of this information, all of these things that are included within the Taiping Guangji, although today thought of as fiction, would have at the time been understood under the genre of history, or shi. They also rely on the conventions and the tropes that are found in the text, the Shiji, as I mentioned to you. And this is part of why the Shiji is actually much more important than simply setting up an imperial history, and in fact actually influences and provides for an entire genre of writing in which people recount events and tell their readers about things that are happening. Okay. Now, obviously, for this talk, I basically used a sample of the tales that I have worked with in the past for other articles and other talks. So that's about 750 of the tales. And just for your information, they basically date from the earliest are dated to the 4th century, the latest to 10th century. The majority of them are composed in the Tang. Um, and that's pretty typical of most of the material in the Taiping Guangji. So let's talk a little bit. I hope I'm still going well on time. I don't want to really go over. Let's talk a little bit then. I don't really have enough time to go into depth of all of the tales or tell stories. Um, I'll just kind of give you guys sort of an overview or the summary of basically what these tales and how these tales use history. So I've been told I've got about 3 minutes left. So let's basically see, well, how are they using history? The first thing is that actually the majority of the tales do not actually provide any sort of time frames or any reference to historical events or other forms of time. That's actually pretty normal. In other words, there doesn't really seem to be an historical consciousness. But a number of the tales, particularly from the Tang, do actually provide certain things. They provide reign dates. This is a very normal thing where they state the emperor and the reign, and then the reign. And they also provide notable events, certain events that happen. But what's very noticeable about this is that all of the reign dates and the notable events are from contemporary periods to when the text is written, particularly in the Kaiyuan era, which is basically 713 to 741 of basically the Tang. Invariably, almost all events that are mentioned basically are in the first 5 years of that reign period. Likewise, the notable events are usually related to the emperor at the time, Xuanzong, particularly when he had to flee to the southwest during a period of civil strife known as the Anlushan Rebellion. This is again something that's often mentioned. When distant periods in the past are mentioned, almost all of the texts mention basically the Three Kingdoms period. I don't have the time to go into that a little bit more, but rather than mentioning any other sort of time, there is a good 1,000 years of written material before the Tang. There seems to be a strong association with the Three Kingdoms period. There are also about 17 tales that talk about Siddhartha Gautama's life, the living Buddha, but these are often probably translations of South Asian tales, so they're probably just associated with with Buddhism. Now, like I said, I'm actually really running out of time. So I'm just going to then summarize. Well, okay, so I've just told you what we see, but why do we see it? Um, Basically, what we tend to see is first and foremost is that time is primarily used as a framing device. It's not really used because most of these time periods are contemporary to when the text tale is being written. They are primarily there to deliver an idea of setting the scene or the space. Oftentimes, the events mentioned have little to nothing to do with the actual events in the tale. One notable one is a person who travels with Xuanzong to the south when Xuanzong flees and turns into a were-tiger. His turning into the were-tiger had nothing to do with, obviously, Xuanzong's fleeing to the south. But the tale does frame it, and creating this sort of time period helps to explain why the protagonist is going down there. However, the obsession with particular space of time and the specific sort of realm, specific sort of like the Kaiyuan era, raises questions around omenology and also the other issue of the extrahuman and the strange. Time is not just simply dates or counting. Within Chinese culture, actually many cultures, pre-modern cultures, time and is strongly associated with basically omenology, divination, cosmology, and astrology, which are often incorporated just naturally because they form how people just innately think of time. Many of these tales being set in specific periods of time, specifically in the most glorious era of the Tang, and the kind of period a period in which strange and supernatural things are occurring, raise questions about how these people understand the various omenology or signs or role of the emperor. And yes, as agreed, this is a great place to wrap up. So I think I'll just wrap it up there and let you know, and then leave it for questions.
Thank you so much, Justin. That was really fascinating. So the Tang period is not something that I know a lot about. Um, but I'm sort of fascinated by this idea of time as a mythological component almost. So I
Mhm.
wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what that sort of shape shifting
Mhm.
has to do with how we view the history, how they're
Mhm.
viewing the history, rather.
Mhm. Mhm. So I think one of the things, the first thing, as I was mentioning, is that I think actually the null response is part of this. What's interesting is they're not really viewing history in many ways. Like a lot of tales are very ahistorical. So I actually think that's very important that they don't have, there isn't this kind of overarching historical consciousness. When it is seen, and when you see this kind of sort of, oh, okay, the time frame makes things change. So the way this functions is that certain periods of time are very well understood as reflecting the moral virtues of the emperor. So time itself is basically the time you live in is good should the emperor illustrate good moral virtue, and this keeps things in order. If the emperor does not demonstrate that, things move into disorder. And so basically it's less to do with like the time itself moves into that, but rather the emperor as a kind of somewhat divine being makes the time in that way. What's interesting is that in later periods, when you mention mythology, later scholars will hearken to distant emperors or mythological emperors in the past who are supposedly so wonderful that everything was great. And this is used as an example of like time of saying, okay, we need to make our empire like this. Here, remember this emperor. This is not what's done here in these tales. They don't really do this. This seems to be a later sort of innovation. Rather, these tales seem to be really deeply concerned with the events that are going on right now and highlighting how those events reflect the kind of time in which they live, whether it be a time of order, disorder, the supernatural, or the normal, or the natural. And that seems to be really what they're kind of how they seem to be framing this sort of using historical events in this way.
That's really incredible. The idea of the supernatural as a shift away from our own times into the abnormative, the othering. Thank you so much, Justin. I'm afraid we don't have time for more questions, but if you
Okay.
do have any questions about Justin's paper or any of the other papers that come up, I do want to encourage you to put your questions in chat. Thank you so much, Justin,
Mhm.
and we are so happy to have had you here.
Yep. Thank you.